Hello everyone who wants to cram more time into From the Depths. I am BorderWise and welcome to the 2025 updated cram cannon tutorial. Or at least the basics of cram cannons, because it's time to have updated tutorials for From the Depths. A lot of the tutorials I've made for cram cannons and other things are quite old now, and it's time for a bit of a refresher. So, to start off with, the basics of cram cannons. The super basic basics. We'll get to the more complicated stuff later. So, first off, what is a cram cannon? Whoops, I lost the camera. So, the cram cannon, as exemplified by our friend Bertha here, first prefab you find in the build menu, is a very big gun. It is a gun which crams pellets into the shells of various types, so you can get a nice party mix of different damage types. That is the whole premise behind them. There are pros and cons to using these things. First off, pros. Big gun, big shell, big damage. This is a big-ass gun. You could basically go camping in this thing. It's so big. And this weapon is one of, if not the most, material to damage efficient weapons in the whole game. It barely touches your ammo reserves, weirdly enough, for such a giant artillery piece, and it does a hell of a lot of damage. Bertha here, for instance, is not the best cram cannon ever. If we turn that off, you'll see just how high the damage numbers for explosive damage is ticking up right there. So that's already like considerably more HE damage than an advanced cannon of this size could possibly do. You'd need a pretty chunky missile in order to get that same amount, and it's nice and compact. So that's another pro to cram cannons, as demonstrated by the Marauder over there. They're actually kind of compact for the numbers you get out of them. And that's about it. They are specialized weapons, and there's a lot of drawbacks to them. They have the most soft counters of anything in the game, because big gun, big shell, slow firing, they miss a lot. There is a wide range of targets which they absolutely suck at dealing with, and nothing exemplifies that more than our old friend the flying squirrel, which is a thing that drives like it's inhaled too much crack cocaine, and you will basically never hit one of these unless you go absolutely mental with your cram cannon, and probably mounted on a vehicle that can outdrive the flying squirrel. That is a more complicated thing for another day. So, and they also have a rotten habit, because everything to do with cram cannons is just one block. They make very tight block clusters, and the AI of most things in From the Depths, by default, aims for, well, if not random blocks, clusters of blocks, which means if you've got a honking big cram cannon filled with little individual pellets, the AI is actually quite highly likely to aim for that, so they are magnets for incoming damage, which you could use to your advantage if you want to, but yeah, that's another downside to them. And also, they get shot down by a lot of stuff, so laser anti-munition defense, C-Wiz, be it APS, or laser, or plasma, or even cram cannons themselves, and missile interceptors will gobble up smaller gauge cram shells or lightly packed cram shells like crazy. So, cram cannons are one of those things that if you want to use them, you gotta build them quite cleverly. It's not like an APS. You can, even though APS is technically more difficult to learn, you can have an APS that can be handy in most situations, and you can kind of get away with that. You can't really do that with a cram cannon. You have to kind of know what you're doing. So let's get into the basic bits of the cram cannon. So here in the build menu, just under simple weapons, this is here is where the magic starts. Let's get rid of Bertha. There's a whole bunch of cram cannon prefabs for you to kind of look at to get the basic idea of them, like how the blocks fit together. None of these things are incredibly optimized, so I don't suggest like using them for realsies on anything you want to do really well, but it's good enough to get the basic idea. To start off with, you've got the firing piece. This is the main part of the cram cannon. This is the chamber of the gun, so to speak. This is where the shell lives before it is fired. If this is destroyed, your cram cannon is absolutely not functional anymore, because this is essentially the, I guess you could call it the brain of the thing. So yeah, it's over here. And then, after the brain of the thing, you need ways to connect all the things. So, connectors, and this might shock you, connect everything together. Usually, the 6-way connector is all you really need. These newer kinds of connectors, like 2 to 5-way connectors, is for more funky stuff that we'll get into probably in a follow-up video. So, here's a connector. It is connected. You could tell because of the UI saying that it is connected. If it is over here, it is not connected. And for these, you gotta connect the correct pegs over here. This 1-way connector is... oh, no, that's a 2-way connector. Put like this, not connected. Put like this, so the peg fits with the peg. Connected. Always look at the block preview if you're confused about how things actually connect together. So we've got our connector. What is next? Packers. So packers are the thing that pack the pellets into the shell. So here is a packer. The kind of, I guess, ice cream cone bits on it are what connect to connectors, and that's pretty much the only thing they do connect to. They do connect to the firing piece as well, but generally you're going to be sticking them onto connectors, and the pointy pegs are what connect to your pellets. These are your pellets. There are a lot of pellets. In order from the bottom, you've got hardener pellets, which boost the kinetic damage and armor piercing of your shell. So basically, reminder on armor piercing, 40 AP will do full damage to a block with 40 AP, so in this case, metal has 40 AP, so this cram shell will do full damage to metal, but because it only has a 1 pellet on 1 packer, 1 connection, it's going to have an absolutely miserable reload time. You can see there it's 253 seconds, not very good, even for a cram cannon that's too slow. So, we've got the hardener pellets, we've got the incendiary pellets, a newer addition to the game, which allows your shell to set things on fire. And brief crib notes on how fire works. The fire fuel is basically its damage. When the shell lands, it sparks a fire with that much fuel. That is the damage it will do, and the intensity is essentially the armor piercing of the fire. So 20 intensity will not do full damage against metal, it'll do half damage. So this particular cram shell, about 3,000 fire fuel, will burn through maybe 10 single metal blocks, possibly less. So yeah, fire best done at high intensity. And by the way, on the firing piece, there's all kinds of fun things you can do here. You can set the intensity a lot higher. It goes up to a maximum of 40, allowing it to do full damage to blocks with 40 fire resistance, like metal. And there's also oxidizer, which allows a certain percentage of the fuel to be used underwater. So you see there, fire oxidizer is actually a hell of a lot. You don't want to make this too high, so something like, I don't know, 0.5 is generally as high as you possibly want to go. Even that's too much. Possibly like 0.25. I'm going to actually keep just pellets around here so we can see what we're doing. Alright, so that's incendiary pellets, slightly complicated. EMP pellets, slightly less complicated. Means the shell will do EMP damage when it hits something. Crib nuts on EMP damage. It is a electrical charge that when it hits something, it will kind of gravitate towards blocks that it will damage. It will take the path of most damage. You protect against with rubber and stone and surge protectors, etc., etc. We're gonna need another packer here, aren't we? Whoop. And frag pellets, like what it says on the tin, it adds fragmentation to your cram cannon. Little mini projectiles that spray out, and you can, in particular, this is important, adjust the angle of it. So if you want a bunch of frags all going in roughly the same direction to kind of reach further into a target, you leave it at about 60. You can go lower, but the lower the fragmentation angle, the less damage each fragment does. So you see the fragments there, 13, about 911 damage. Go up to 98, it does now 13 fragments and 1,888 damage. So it does full damage per fragment at 180 degrees. Generally, 180 degrees is what you want for a cram, either for an airburst cram shell or for a penetration depth cram shell. We'll get to that in a hot second. And finally, we've got HE pellets, which is actually the bread and butter. This is almost the default pellet. Like, particularly smaller crams are going to have this, and it's very simple. It means the cram shell explodes, HE damage has a radius, it is murder on lightly armored blocks, and that is your pellets. Very, very nice. But in order to make the cram bigger and meaner, the minimum gauge is 1000 millimeters. You probably want it bigger than that usually. So that's where gauge increases come in. They make your cram bigger, and if I just skip ahead a bit, here are our barrels, and if I do something like this, you'll notice the barrel gets a lot bigger. It is now 1500 millimeters. The diameter of this barrel is in fact taller than quite a few human beings. You could take a stroll down that if you're if you are roughly 5 foot. So there is that. Now the reason I mentioned cram gauge increases first is because you generally want these first because these are cheaper than payload compactors. Payload compactors connect onto your payload packers, and they just increase how much pellets can be packed into the thing. So currently we've got a full pack on the pellets of 625. Add this, it now is 656. So these things are generally added in lesser quantities than the pellets, and they're used to just adjust your cram cannon to that final sweet spot of reload speed and packing. And speaking of the barrels that we just went to, I'm doing this out of order. There's a bunch of gauge increases, by the way. The good old block connects on 6 sides because it's a cube. The gauge increase 3 corners does exactly what it sounds like. Connects on 3 quarters. On the top, connects on just the bottom, by the looks of it. Nope, it doesn't. Where's it connect? It connects on the side, connects on the top, does not connect. This is weird. It connects in funny ways. When in doubt, always look at the pegs. So, does not connect that way. Nope, it doesn't. Okay, and then you got the corners, which only connect on 4 sides. These are very, very handy indeed, because if we have... Let's just get rid of all this. So, if we have a gauge increase corner like that, and like that, say we've got 2 different cram systems, you can arrange the corners like this, and they do not connect. That is handy when you want more than one firing piece in a turret, for example, that good old triple barrel thing. Not perfect cram setup, but we'll get to that in a bit. Again, there's a lot to go over. And then the port, which just increases like so. Visually, pretty much the same. It's just, I don't know, a lot of these are remnants from the days when it's just like they had visual differences and that's it. And then the pipe, which is actually pretty convenient, it connects just like a pipe. Very handy if you want to put connections like right next to each other. Alright, so that's the gauge increases. There's 2 funny things here. The predictor just has your cram can, just basically shows, if you're controlling the cram cannon, where the shell is going to go. So it roughly follows where the shell is aiming. I pretty much never use that. In fact, like, I can't remember the last time I actually put that on a thing. Generally, you don't need it at all. And, but the interface screen is a real relic from times gone by. This used to be the only way to see the statistics of your cram cannon. These days you just hover over pretty much any part of it, and particularly the connectors, the firing piece, or the barrel, and it will tell you what's what. This is basically a legacy block. It's completely useless. You never need it. And what else? Let's talk about the barrels. The barrel is important. So to start off with, where do we go? Like, this is ordered kind of weird. Generally, with your cram cannon, the first thing you want is an elevation barrel, because this increases the elevation that you can fire at. So you see here, whoop, the elevation is about halfway down this long list of text. I can't actually show you there. Max barrel rotation elevation is now 45 degrees. Max barrel azimuth is 25 degrees. So it can aim 45 degrees up and down, 25 degrees left and right. Add another elevation. It's now 55 degrees elevation and 15 azimuth. Great. So that's usually what I put first. There's 3 different elevation barrels here. They're just cosmetic differences. There's no real functional difference between them. Then we've got motor-driven barrels. These things basically speed up the traverse of your gun. So if we don't have that, you can see here the barrel rotation speed, which is the speed at which your barrel moves around is about 9.53 degrees per second. This is not a particularly high gauge cram gun, so once you get up to around like 1,800 to 2,000 millimeters, it's really, really slow if you do not have these things. You'll see now it is more than doubled. It's now 19.07 degrees per second. So, just to show you the difference, you'll see just how slowly this thing is elevating. And if I put this here, it elevates a lot faster. It also improves the azimuth if you have a whole bunch of these, but you need a lot in order to offset the elevation barrel. Or not. Maybe I'm full of nonsense. Anyway, the default azimuth and elevation is 35 degrees, 35 degrees. Generally, if you're mounting something on a turret, that is going to be pointing at the enemy anyway, the azimuth is taken care of, so you want to max out the elevation, which takes 4 of these. 75 degrees is as high as you can elevate your gun, but that's 75 degrees up and down, which is pretty good. And azimuth of 5 degrees, which isn't a hell of a lot. So usually 4 elevation barrels does the trick, and then I usually do something like, again, just cosmetic differences between these things. 1, 2, 3, 4. Motor different barrels, that usually does very nicely. And then we have actual barrels. So all these do is that they decrease the movement, the rotation speed of your barrel, but they greatly increase accuracy. You'll see down there at the very bottom of that wall of text, our inaccuracy is 0.46, which means when the shell is fired, basically that is how much is going to deviate from where the gun is actually aiming. That is actually significantly inaccurate. You preferably want 0.3 inaccuracy on all things that need to aim at their target, preferably better. So if we plonk down 1, 2, 3, 4 of these, that's down to 0.3 already. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and now it's down to 0.29. That is much, much nicer. Alright, now we get into the funky barrel. So the heavy barrel is exactly the same as the regular barrel, except it's a lot tougher. So you'll see the health of the barrel is around 1,000 health and 50 armor. Basically, by default, all barrels have that kind of stat on them. Heavy barrel is 1,200 health and 60 armor. It is also a lot heavier. It's in fact twice as heavy. So these tend to go on the end of your gun or right at the base of it, just to ensure that your weapon can still fire even if most of the battle gets blown off. Remember, guideline and from the depths, it's not if your system, whatever it is, gets shot at, it's when it gets shot at. So heavy barrels just make your gun barrel a lot more survivable if you put them in the right spot. So, that is that. Again, 3 different variants. They're all function exactly the same. The different variants are just for looks. Then you've got the flash suppressant barrel, which is very handy. It basically means that your shell can't be detected as easily by anti-munition defenses. So, little reminder, anti-munition defenses require munition warners, generally, to see incoming munitions, and this sees the munition coming in, and then active defenses can do something about it. Now, if we look at this CRAM cannon, you'll see where is it? Bloody hell, there's a lot of stats on here. I think over here, where is it? Alright, so over by the diameter, so 1,100 millimeters, 436 meters detection range. Now, that's not super great, because that is well within the effective range of, say, a laser anti-munition defense system, or missile interceptors, or CWIS, or something like that. Dropping that gives the shell a little bit more time to sneak through, particularly if it's a big hefty shell, or if it's fired in a big volley. That's where this comes in. Flash suppression barrel, you'll see 436 meters, it is now 218 meters. It is basically cut in half. The downside of this is that it does slow the shell down. So you'll see down there, shell speed, just below recoil, just above barrel rotation, is 300 meters per second. Now it is 240 meters per second. 60 meters per second is kind of a significant dip, which means your CRAM is less likely to hit its target, particularly if it's a fast-moving or erratic target, but it's more likely to sneak through a munition defense. So it is a definite trade-off. I have had great success with and without suppressor barrels. It depends on your cram cannon. Generally speaking, it is better to use it if you know you're going to be shooting at stuff that will shoot down your shells, but you can also do clever things by having some crams with the suppressor barrel and others without, and then the ones without act as distractions, and the ones with sneak past while anti-munition munition systems are busy. So, it gets complicated. And then over here we have the recoil depression barrel, which basically does a similar thing. It reduces recoil. So, let's see here. All the stats. Alright, so you see the recoil number just below reload time. This is not usually a big problem with cram cannons because you'll notice something about all these components. They're pretty heavy. So, weight of 40, 40, 40, that is the same weight as a metal block. And mass in from the depths is really good for absorbing the force of recoil. If you have a massive gun, you're probably putting it on something that can handle the recoil of it. But if you are trying to, I don't know, go full river monitor and put a big-ass cram cannon on a tiny thing, you might find problem with recoil, particularly if it's mounted quite high up on your craft. It might make it roll, it might make it behave in funky ways, and so recoil suppression basically reduces that recoil. So, what do we have here? We have recoil of 1966, hell of a year, and now recoil is considerably less. And unlike the flash suppressor barrel, these can stack. Unfortunately, they do also continually reduce your shell speed, which is not great. I pretty much never use recoil reducer barrels. They're not really necessary. If your craft is large enough, and if it's built correctly, like it doesn't just roll around, if it's got proper ballast and keel and all that stuff, see, more stuff to know, you don't need to worry about recoil suppressor barrels. You basically never use them. They do look cool, though. There's a lot of varieties, but thankfully you can use decoration, which, by the way, you can just use like this, Control-Shift-X. I just plonked a fake bit of barrel on the end, and it looks cool, and that's it. So you don't need to slap your recoil suppression barrel just to make your cram look pretty. Now, there is one more barrel to talk about, one that I hardly ever use. This is a funky one. This is the bomb chute. This drastically changes how your cram cannon works, and so you gotta think ahead what you're doing. So, it sets the accuracy to be perfect. It removes all recoil. It has a tiny muzzle flash sound. Greatly increases the elevation and azimuth fields of fire and barrel move speeds, and it fixes the projectile speed at 40 meters per second. So, look at all the stats there. We've got 228 meters per second. Actually, let's get rid of that because we don't want it. 240, and recoil, 1966. So, whoop. Now, 40 meters per second, no recoil whatsoever, and even less detection range. The detection range is like 87 meters. That's nothing. So, this is specifically for basically turning a cram shell into a cram bomb. Now, I have never had any luck whatsoever with using the bomb chute or making cram bombers in general, but recent changes to cram cannons might change that. Hopefully, in this little mini-series of tutorials, I will be able to make something that really takes advantage of the bomb chute. And if you watching this have made something that really takes advantage of the bomb chute and the wacky things it does, do let me know. It'll be very interesting. Now, that's all the barrels, and that's all the pellets, and that's all the connecty things and the gauges things. There's two more blocks to talk about, and these are very important blocks. The fuse box is where the magic happens with a cram cannon. Let's get rid of this munition warner, it's bothering me. So, this fella changes what your shell behaves like. So, the rest of the cram cannon is determining the stats of your shell, how much health it has, what kind of damage it does, how much damage it does. The barrels determine how easily the shell can be detected, how fast the shell moves, the recoil, and so on and so forth. The fusing box is the spice on top. So, first up, tip conversion, hollow point. What does that mean? Well, you'll notice, looking at the stats of this cram cannon, the kinetic damage is roughly 2000 and has 5.7 AP. Kinetic damage refers to something that is essentially poking through something. It's like how a bullet works. You fire it, it goes through things if it can penetrate. If you tick this box, it changes the kinetic damage of the cram cannon to thump damage. What the hell does that mean? So, thump damage is like kinetic damage, except it doesn't penetrate. It hits something, it spreads out the damage, and basically takes a chunk out of it instead of punching through it. It is generally not as good. Like, hollow point crams, particularly big ones, are hilariously fun. They are not as good as just a nice, proper, like, penetration cram. Something that can punch into a target and then detonate its payload inside it. A hollow point cram will just tear a big chunk out of the outside armor, but won't get into the nice squishy bits. So this is kind of fun and gimmicky. Generally speaking, hollow points are not worth it unless you want a pure kinetic cram. So if you want just a cram that uses nothing but hardener pellets, say maybe you want a decoy shell that has just maximum shell health. See, this one right here has 40,000 health already, and this gun is tiny, and it's like not optimized at all. And yeah, so that is a valid use for hollow point, is if you're just going full kinetics anyway, because if you just do, like, if you just have a regular AP shell, it just kind of pokes a sad hole through the thing and doesn't really do much proper damage, and often wastes its damage in over-penetrating. Like, because crams, even without any hardener pellets, they can do crap tons of kinetic damage. So that is your one time to use hollow point, I would recommend. I'm getting ahead of myself. We're not at the optimization point yet. But anyway, so then you have the fuses, and this is where a lot of the magic happens. So, low altitude fuse. This basically causes the shell to explode when it drops below a certain altitude. This standard thing, 500 meters, is really terrible because 500 meters is the edge of space in From the Depths. So generally, whenever I've used this, and I pretty much only use these on mortars, again, we'll get into mortars in a little while. We actually need to go through the firing pieces, bits and pieces. I generally set this to something like -1, so just the shell just dips below the waterline, which means it's missed, and it goes kablooey. High altitude is when it explodes above a certain height. I've literally never used this. I have never found a use for this at all. I would not bother. Hypothetically, you could make a flak shell like it, like a real-life World War II style flak shell. In practice, pretty useless. I've literally never found a use for this. If anyone watching this has found a use for this, do let me know. I'd be very curious. Because basically both of these things are generally rendered useless by the time from launch shell. And it's just, it puts a timer on the fuse. Now, in order for this thing to work, generally what you want is to set it to max, and then you have this block here, the laser targeter. And this causes, this adjusts the actual timing of the fuse to explode at roughly the point where the cannon will think that'll hit the target. So if a target is about 500 meters away, and the local weapon controller controlling the cannon thinks, alright, so I'm going to fire the gun and it's going to hit X amount of seconds from now, the laser targeter will set the fuse automatically to be that time. Now, important thing, you want to generally set a little offset, and a positive offset, which means it'll explode slightly after the anticipated point of impact, because cram shells are generally slow, and particularly for something that you want to pierce into the target, you want to set this positive, and generally 0.1 is the bare minimum, because cram shells are pretty slow. If you had a very fast APS shell, its timed fuse would be set much lower, but cram shells are slow, so something like this would do the trick. So, can you please let me go? Let me go, let me live. Alright. Then we have inertial, and this is relatively straightforward in comparison. If the shell hits something and is deflected, whether it's, say, it's a piece of sloping armor, yes, that is a thing in From the Depths, or maybe it's a planar shield. Reminder, planar shield is this thing, projects magic voodoo energy shield that shells can bounce off of. Random chance. If a cram shell hits one of these and bounces off, this fuse will cause it to explode. This is, generally speaking, compulsory on any shell that has a kind of explosive payload. So with frag and with HE, you pretty much always want something like this, unless you've got something very specific in mind. And for, say, hardeners or EMP, or actually, yeah, also incendiary, you do want inertial, but with hardeners and with EMP, you might as well not bother, because if you just want something that hits a thing, does thump damage or does EMP or incendiary damage. A hollow point does the same thing because EMP incendiary doesn't do anything if it hits a shield and explodes. It needs to be touching the enemy craft. So that, very useful. And then you have the penetration depth fuse, which is the neglected sibling of the time from first impact fuse. This is very simple. It just means that if the shell penetrates something, this is the distance it goes in before it explodes. Now, this sounds like a good idea. This is very easily fooled by craft which are built something like this. I'm going to just spawn this in at about 200 meters, and on my team, actually made that 500 meters. So something like this. It's our old friend the Bulwark. If you have a shell that is fired at the target, and it punches 2 meters into the target and explodes, an armor setup like this, so 1... That's a bad location, so if I shrink the blocks, here we have about 1, 2, 3 meters of armor, and then you have this huge air gap, and all the squishy vulnerable bits are deep inside the ship. Empty space is one of the best armors in the game, weirdly enough. And so that is why the penetration depth fuse is kind of not that useful. It is much, much more effective, generally, get out of here, shield projector, we don't need you anymore, to use this, the time from first impact. Now, why is this better? Well, this can be customized. Generally about 0.2 seconds seems to do the trick, depending on how far you want. You can set this up a little bit higher. Generally, 0.5 is the furthest I would ever go. That's if you're shooting at something that's like a floating island, pretty much. Because if you go all the way up here, anything that your shell can travel through for about 60 seconds probably would crash your computer. So it's something like 0.2 specifically, generally does the trick just fine. So, this, the best fuses by far, time from launch, time from first impact and inertial. Occasionally, like, I don't know, low altitude is useful. Penetration depth, I never use that. High altitude, I never use that. Hollow point is for gimmicks or for massive pure kinetic shells that you are using if you want to be clever. We'll get to the cleverness later. Now, we should probably go over the firing piece and all the settings in here because it's important. So, default thing with stuff and from the depths, required accuracy before fire. The default kind of sucks. You want to set that as minimum as possible because if you set this higher than the minimum, it means the gun will fire when the weapon is that angle off from the target, which means your first shot is almost certainly going to miss. It is pretty easy to tell when combat testing craft whether people have remembered to set this, because their first shots almost always miss. You want something like this, and you really want to set this for cram cannons, because these things tend to miss with their opening volleys anyway. It's bad. And then you have your weapon slots over here. If you ever plan on manually controlling the weapons of your craft, it is a good idea to set this up ahead of time. On any slot you care to name, cram cannons generally are like big battleship guns, so primary weapons, usually number 1 is what I set them to, but again, you set up whatever does this. Don't fire a load below 0% energy. I never touch this setting because it doesn't matter. If you run out of ammunition for your main big artillery, you've probably lost anyway. Here's statistics keeping track of the gun. Copy to clipboard, paste from clipboard. Synchronization works like it does with all weapons. You can synchronize things up with other weapons, so this thing will only fire after another thing fires. Not the point of this tutorial, we're moving on. Stats, we're just looking at all the various stats of this. As you can tell, material per firepower, 1266.3. This is awful. This is a terrible cram cannon I've made here because it's just to show off the blocks. And lots of stats here for nerds. This is more important. Minimum packing. You can set this if you want your cram cannon to fire faster. You almost never want to do this unless you are wanting to do something cheeky or sneaky, or you just, I don't know, want to make a fast firing cram for giggles. So you'll see the reload time there is 52.05. If I set this down to minimum, it will now reload. It will pack only for 5.74 seconds, which means its shell will be absolutely pathetic and will do almost no damage. Generally, that's something you'd only want to do when you're making a designated decoy cram, something to fire very cheap, inexpensive shells to kind of muck up, like, kind of screw with enemy defenses. Again, there's tactics and clever tricks you can do with cram cannons that we'll get into later, hopefully. This video is long enough as it is. This video is already longer than I wanted it to be. So set that back up. Maximum cram muzzle velocity. You can set this lower. Generally, you'd set it to something like 150 meters for a cram that has a bit more arc to it, for example, a mortar. 300 meters is the max cram speed, unless you are a crazy person and you want to go into the options menu, into the config, and override the default like that. Once I do that, you'll see that the muzzle velocity has gone up to 480 meters per second. The game is not balanced with that in mind, so best not to. So let's do that again. Let's restore the laws of physics. And we've got a whole bunch of options here. So fragmentation angle, incendiary intensity, incendiary oxidizer, we've already talked about. You can also set the idle elevation and the idle azimuth. This is purely for aesthetic purposes, by the way. So if we do something like, I don't know, let's have a whole bunch of motor-driven barrels. So you'll see here, cram settings, incendiary. The azimuth can be set like that, the elevation can be set like that. That is purely for looks. And here is an interesting setting. This sets at what angles your weapon will try to aim at. APS has a very similar setting to this. So low angles means that it tries to make the shell arc as little as possible. High angles means it'll try and arc the shell as high as possible. So you can have it prefer low, only low, prefer high, only high, and direct line. Direct line means it points straight at the target. That is useless. For cram cannons, generally, don't bother. There's only one situation I can think of, and it's to do with like making a cram shotgun. I've made a video on that before. Don't worry about it. If you're just learning about this, that's a silly thing to do. And then you have the reconfigure loadout, which honestly, most of the time, you should never ever touch this because it stuffs up your cram Tetris something awful. So you see right here, we've got a whole bunch of different pellets and a little compactor right there. Maybe I want to change all of this to one type of pellet, so maybe I lose control of my senses, switch that to a hollow point, and say I want all hardener, please. All hardener all the time. And do that, and you hit this button, and it converts every pellet on there, including the compactors, into hardener pellets. The problem you run into is that this system, this essentially shortcut, is not smart enough to recognize what bits you want where. Generally, with pellets, you want as many connections on them as possible, and with compactors, you don't want too many connections on them, because that's just a waste of a space that could be used for a pellet. So, like, use this with caution. I use it sometimes just, you know, for testing purposes, but do be aware, if you use this, you might absolutely stuff up your Tetris, and you probably best do not do that. Okay then, that's basically it for cram cannons. I don't think I've missed out anything in particular. Let's just make a cram cannon quickly. Firstly, let's delete the bulwark, because that's fun. So, just sticking with what we've learned so far, let's just make a lightning-fast cram cannon, complete with a local weapon controller, to make it. So, this is not going to be amazing, it's just going to show off the basics. So, what are we going to do here? We're going to do, like, 1, 2, 3, 4. This is going to be bad Tetris, just because I'm in a hurry. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. We're just going to have a whole bunch of HE pellets. This is awful Tetris. I cannot stress that enough. This is bad. Don't do this. This is because I just want to show you very quickly how this all works. So we've got our connectors, we've got our pellets, only 2 connections. This is bad. You want at least 4 whenever possible. We'll get to that. Fusing box. I'm going to just set it with an inertial fuse. I'm going to set this to minimum, set the weapon group to 1, and we're going to spawn in a hapless victim. Let's see here. What do we want? Let's spawn in at 500 meters, a nice easy target. Let's spawn in the Marauder, because the Marauder is hilariously fun to shoot at. And we need a local weapon controller, so I'm going to just stick one back here. All in one. Ta-da! Kablooey! And we've successfully shot the Marauder in the face. This is what we like to see. And this CRAM has a decently quick reload speed, because it's just, well, it's got a lot of pellets, even though it's set up incorrectly. So, that is the super bare basics of a CRAM cannon, and if you're new to From the Depths, I hope this is enough of a hint to you that this basics tutorial, covering just the basic blocks and how they fit together, and the basics of the firing piece and all that, 40-minute tutorial, and I apologize for that. I was shooting for half an hour and I missed. So, do stay posted. There's going to be more of these. This is going to be a mini-series of, like, covering CRAM cannons and what they do. And a lot of more, like, technical stuff I had to leave out of this one. So stick around. Please be patient. I will get around to you. Your call is important to us. Beep, boop, beep, boop. Please hold. So thank you all so much for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. Support me on Patreon or YouTube membership if you like. It really helps, and there's fun perks in it for you. Thank you to all my current supporters, and I will see you next time in another CRAM cannon tutorial for From the Depths. Farewell!